I grew up in New Zealand, specifically, although I was born in a small town called Cambridge. Most of my life growing up, I lived in Auckland. Auckland's the biggest city in New Zealand. When I was growing up, it was approaching 1 million people. It's over 1.5 million now, out of a total population, I think, is approaching 5 million. When I was growing up, New Zealand was 3 million. So it was a small country, or seen as a small country. It always looked tiny in the map when you've got hulking Great Australia across the ditch. And growing up in New Zealand, there was always a very strong cultural cringe. There was a sense that nothing that was made or created or invented in New Zealand had any great value unless it went overseas and was successful there. So if if a band was successful in New Zealand, then that didn't mean anything. But if they then had a hit overseas, then suddenly, they are important, they're significant. The rest of the world has said this matters, so therefore this does matter now. So, I don't know, Crowded House or Split Ends or Peter Jackson and making, the Lord of the Rings films. Peter Jackson was making sort of like low budget slasher horror movies like Bad Taste and Brain Dead. I mean, great fun and really quirky, plus Exploding Sheep's always a winner. But it wasn't really until I think when he did Heavenly Creatures, which I think got an Oscar nomination, and suddenly people were like, this is proper. And then obviously Lord of the Rings, massive success, huge money, and suddenly, no, he's now Sir Peter Jackson, because it's had the tick of validation from overseas. So growing up in New Zealand, you always got a sense that anything from overseas was better, and anything local was somehow a pale imitation of the proper thing. So that's something, you always felt you were fighting against that. And you always felt that if you wanted to be successful, you had to leave, was this sort of the defining thing. The other thing you had in New Zealand was it was called the Great OE, the Great Overseas Experience. You finished school, and if you didn't go to university, you then spent 2 or 3 years working hard, saving money, so then you could do the big OE. You would travel to Europe. You would then get a job probably in a pub in Earl's Court along with the Australians. And then you saved up money and you bought your VW Combi van, and then you drove around Europe, picking grapes in Italy or olives in Greece or wherever, and you traveled around and you met people and you might meet the love of your life or whatever. And then you went back to New Zealand and you settled down and you had kids and a family and bought your quarter-acre section with your house on it, none of which you could do anymore now because it's just hideously expensive. And so that was the trajectory. That was what you did. And growing up, I was like, oh, okay, right. So I finished high school. I didn't go to university because both my brothers had gone to university and flunked out because they were too busy being in bands and being on the college radio station and having a good time. And I thought, I have no work ethic. I will do exactly the same, except I can't be in bands. Because I can't play music. So I was like, what am I going to do? What am I for? And I didn't want to be a teacher because my mother had been a teacher, and I was like, I'm never doing that. Irony, come back to bite me in the ass later. So I did a journalism training course and then became a journalist and did that for 4.5, 5 years. And then wanted to go into features, couldn't get into features, couldn't get into TV, couldn't get into radio. My accent wasn't good enough. My diphthongs were problematic for radio. So as a consequence, it was like, time to leave. So at the age of 23, packed my bags, having saved my money, and emigrated to the UK. And was like, okay, now what? And fell in with a bad crowd. Comics. Such a bad crowd. And so I became, sort of stumbled into a job in comics, which I had not planned, did not realize was a job that people even did. Because growing up in New Zealand, I mean, we got comics. We got Marvel comics irregularly. We got DC comics, but they were reprinted in black and white only in Australia and shipped to us. And we did get 2000 AD, but very irregularly. You would get the Christmas issue in time for Easter, because it was shipped out, so it took 3 months to arrive. You couldn't guarantee that you would get the next issue after the one that you had, so it was impossible to read any sequential storytelling, which was really problematic, which is why I was never a huge 2000 AD reader, because it was just impossible. And we didn't get comic shops till 1985, so it was the corner shop or nothing. So it wasn't easy being a comics reader, so I would have a comics collection, and then I would just junk it at the secondhand bookshop, which is where all comics collections goes today in New Zealand, and then I'd start again. So I read comics growing up in New Zealand, and then started reading sort of US independent comics, Cerebus the Aardvark and things like that. And then when I emigrated to the UK and discovered that you could have a career editing comics, I was like, oh, this is incredible. So when I arrived in the UK in January 1990, I had a letter of introduction to the editor of Doctor Who magazine, and that helped me get my indefinite leave to remain. And then when I went up to see him at the office, and he was like, no, there's no job here. I was like, okay, slightly depending upon that. He said, you can write me a couple of articles. Fine, okay, good. And he gave me the best piece of advice. He just said, just buy The Guardian on a Monday. They've got 20 pages of jobs in the media classified ads section, which they did at that point, and just apply for everything. Just keep throwing mud at the wall. So I did. I bought The Guardian the next Monday with its media jobs section, which had 20 pages of jobs, and I applied for everything. I mean, I still haven't heard back about the Channel 4 gardening show called Dig with an exclamation mark, because I was thinking I could be a presenter on the gardening show. Never got back to me, bastards. But yeah, so I just started applying for everything. And the first gig I got was as a sub-editor on a TV listings magazine for BSB, who were the rivals to Sky. BSB were notable because they had British satellite broadcasting, and they had squarials. Their aerials were square. That was their point of difference. So I worked there for about 4 months, and they offered me a full-time gig. And I was like, these people are going to be out of business within a year, as they were. But at the same time, I kept applying for jobs, and I saw a job advertised, which was they wanted an assistant editor for a new launch from the House of Tharg from 2000 AD, which was going to be Revolver. So I applied for the assistant editor job at Revolver on the basis that I was a working journalist and I'd been a sub-editor, and therefore I could probably learn the craft of editing comics, and I had other skills to bring that would make me helpful as an assistant editor. Now, I didn't get the job because one of the things they wanted on Revolver, they were looking for people who were fluent in more than one language, because they were hoping to build up a whole European thing, maybe reprint some European material in Revolver, put material into the European marketplace. So they hired Frank Wynne, who's an incredible translator, who's won so many awards for his translations now. So he worked on Revolver with Pete Hogan. But I didn't get the job, but Steve McManus, who'd done the interview with Pete, said, well, we're launching a Judge Dredd spin-off in a few months, so stay in touch because I'd like you to be my assistant on that instead. And I was like, yeah, brilliant, okay. That sounds more creative than doing writing listings for The Bold and the Beautiful and The Young and the Restless, which is what was showing on B-Sky B, or BSB as it was. So sure enough, he got back and we stayed in touch, had the occasional pint, and then he said, right, okay, when can you start? So I turned down a full-time job at the listings magazine for a 3 days a week job, paying 65 quid a day instead of the 100 quid a day I was getting 5 days a week at the other job. So I gave up 500 quid a week to be paid less than 200 quid a week to work on the Judge Dredd magazine, in the hope that it might turn into a full-time job. But it just seemed more interesting, and I was young and I had no dependents, and I was just paying rent, and I thought, yeah, whatever, let's give it a go. I could get by on beans. So that's how I became a comics editor. I was Steve's assistant, and Steve was a brilliant mentor, taught me, how to do the job, how to work with creators, how to manage people who have been in the industry 20 years longer than you, have 20 years more experience and have very strong opinions, which is a few of the writers in British comics, and how to get on with people, and how to be, and yet try and find a way to sort of, have a vision and communicate a vision in a way that doesn't completely get people's backs up, and just try and find new creators as well and bring new talent on. I learned all that from Steve and got to work with amazing writers, John Wagner and Alan Grant, and then sort of help bring on new writers like Robbie Morrison and Gordon Rennie, and then all these incredible artists like Dean Ormston and Pete Doherty and Nick Percival, Frank Quitely, Greg Staples, although Greg got very angry with me for a period because I sent back his artwork and I addressed it to Greg, Too Dark Staples, because he was going through a period of very dark artwork. It was all painted and very dark. He got quite grumpy about that and was quite grumpy at me for quite some time afterwards. Sorry, Greg. But yeah, so yes, I edited comics for 10 years and had a blast doing it, and started writing my own comics, not very well, and then went into writing novels, tie-in novels, Judge Dredd, and then Doctor Who, and then eventually, after 10 years of editing, I was just burnt out. I had nothing left to give, and the irony, and I think the tipping point for me was I got the comic 2000 AD to the year 2000, which was my goal. And then it looked like Rebellion, who this video games developer and publisher based in Oxford, were going to buy it in 1999. I thought, brilliant, finally, people who care want to spend money on this, want to support it, want to see it grow and sustain. Whereas Egmont were just, who by this point owned 2000 AD and the magazine, were just like milking the cow for the last drops they could get out of it before they took it around the back of the milking shed and put a bolt through it. And I could see the way things were going. If we stayed at Egmont, we weren't going to survive for much longer, because every year the budget got cut by 5 to 10%. Every year, do more with less. And there's only so far you can sustain that before eventually you just run out of cuts to make. You start hitting bone after a while. So when Rebellion were going to buy it, I thought, finally, this is it. Okay, and it gave me a new lease of life. I thought, brilliant. Okay, then we'll have masters who understand and care and love the product, rather than tolerate it because we bring in $100,000 a year as profit, which is what we had to do every year, or else we were going to get sent to the knacker's yard. And then the deal fell through. They could not come to an agreement, and I was just like, no. And I went, that's it. I'm out. I'm going to get us literally to the year 2000, and then as soon as I can get out the door, I will. So I handed my notice in on the 30th of March, the year 2000. And the next day, Rebellion re-entered negotiations to buy the comics. And I was like, oh, now, you couldn't have done, no? Okay, fine. It was all right because it was time for me to go anyway, frankly. I was still burnt out. That wasn't going to change. And it was going to be a pretty tumultuous, the next 18 months, my assistant Andy Diggle, who succeeded me as editor, quite rightly too, and was full of beans and could not wait to get his hands on the Rosette of Sirius and seize control of the means of production, and do it the way it was supposed to be done, and properly this time. Good luck, Andy. And ironically, it ended up the last day of my notice was the day before it changed hands. It was the 1st of July 2000, Rebellion became the new owners, and I left on the 30th of June. I was like, oh well, it seems like I am officially part of the past. So relocated to Scotland, became a freelance writer. Things occurred. Comics are an art form. The French call them the ninth art. Okay. So comics, absolutely, they're far more than just entertainment. They're not just something to occupy children. As has been demonstrated countlessly times in English for the past 35 years, and as our European cousins have been demonstrating for far longer than that. It's a unique storytelling language that uses the combination of words and pictures in a way that no other storytelling narrative form can. The craft skills required to do comics well are unique. There's a lot of screenwriting in it. There's a lot of painting and visual arts in it. There's some elements of prose in it. But it's this absolutely singular combination of things. You can do things in comics that are virtually impossible in any other art form. So, there's that. The state of comics now and the future of comics. Well, actually, comics are in a pretty rude health at the moment, particularly if your obsession is not just massive sales. Because, 30 years ago, X-Men #1, the relaunch with Jim Lee, sold 8 million copies, okay, to the direct sales marketplace. But the reality was that was all speculators, all boom, all the time. And that was being driven by people who weren't actually reading the comics they were collecting. I don't have a lot of respect for people who collect comics but don't read them. Surely the purpose of comics is to tell stories through words and art, and to be read and to be appreciated, and to maybe gain something from it, learn something, have your ideas challenged, possibly. God forbid we should challenge people's ideas or their preconceptions about what something should be. Horror. So actually, the state of comics has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. The growth of manga and the availability of manga has changed the gender profile of who reads and enjoys comics massively. 20 years ago, you went to a comics convention and there would be wives and girlfriends dragged kicking and screaming into the building and then running out as soon as humanly possible. That is not the case now. It's almost a 50-50 gender split of who enjoys and appreciates comics, particularly manga. And that has therefore also altered the profile of who creates comics. It used to be that the only women who were working in comics were wives and girlfriends, and they were colorists and letterers. Very occasionally artists and very occasionally writers were allowed into the massive boys club, the sausage fest that was comics, particularly in the UK. That has changed completely. There are still some, holdouts, recidivist areas, but nonetheless, the people who are creating comics, the nature of those people has changed completely. Brilliant. So that means different stories are being told, different perspectives are being shared, and you're able to find a comic about not almost anything, but an awful lot of experiences and stories that you couldn't 20 years ago when it was like 2000 AD and the Beano was just about the only game in town, and British comics and tiny indies and the margins of whatever. Now you have the Phoenix Comics for Kids, which does incredible storytelling for kids through comics. You have the other thing which has revolutionized what you can do with comics and how you can get them into the world is the growth of sort of comic marts and comic cons that enables indie creators to interact directly with new and existing readers, hand sell their work. The fact that comic shops are willing to take self-published work, which they wouldn't touch with a barge pole for a long time. If it didn't come from Diamond, it didn't count, or Titan. And Kickstarter and crowdfunding enables comics creators to cover the cost of printing and distribution. They get to retain all rights in their work, which is key. They get to tell the stories they want to tell, not have to stick space lasers and whatever it has to be. Because if they want to get a gig at 2080, it needs to be science fiction or fantasy, or a little bit of horror now, more these days. But a strip like Button Man stuck out like a sore thumb because it wasn't 2080 it was just brilliant comics. But it was like, what's this doing here? But great comics deserve to be seen and read and enjoyed. But Kickstarter enables anybody to, if they get their act together and do it well, to create and print and distribute a comic. And if they do it digitally, then it can be enjoyed by anybody in the world. If they want to print they want to distribute a physical comic, well, yeah, thanks to Brexit, that's going to cost you a little bit more now. Curse you, Brexit. But yeah, so Kickstarter has enabled people to do niche titles that might only sell 100 copies, and that's not, you couldn't print it to a high professional standard, and you couldn't distribute it. You couldn't afford to do that before. So that has democratized comics massively. And as a consequence, like I say, comics is in a rude health, and you are getting a generation of new creators emerging who don't have to go through the usual stepping stone portfolios of 2000 AD or the Beano or Marvel UK, Panini UK, in order to try and get their way onto a ladder and work their way up. You don't have to give away your rights. You can retain your rights. You can publish your work. You can have control over your creativity. You're not going to make your fortune, chances are. Let's put that one to bed. But you can take something that is the thing that you love to do, and you can find an audience for that. It's never going to make you a millionaire, chances are. You're not going to be Mark Miller. You're not going to sell your universe to Netflix, sorry. But, you can do the thing that you love, and you can find an audience, and you can build an audience for it over time. And, what creator wouldn't want to do that?